welcome back to Scholar Spotlight. This is an initiative of Global Policy Next Generation, where we get to talk to really brilliant early career scholars about their work. And I'm so excited to be here today with Dr. Amy Janswood, who does incredible research on the environment and energy policy. And she's going to talk to us about her book, which looks at comparative energy policy and oil pipelines. Is that right, Amy?
That's right.
Great. Why don't you give me sort of the 30-second pitch on your work?
Yeah, so my book project, Mega Pipelines, Mega Resistance, is really trying to explain the role of social movements in resisting new mega oil sands pipelines in Canada, but also some in the US as well.
Wow, that's timely.
yeah, it's always lots to talk about with pipelines. So it's really quite remarkable that social movements have been able to have quite an influence on disrupting some of the proposed plans for new oil sands pipelines, particularly because the oil and gas industry in Canada, as in other countries, has had a lot of political power. And so I'm really just tracing the influence of these campaigns and really making an argument that these campaigns have been quite successful when we wouldn't maybe expect them to be so successful in using a combination of strategies and getting a lot of broad-based support to resist some of this new infrastructure.
Yeah, it sort of sounds like it's almost a hopeful story, right? That we can, in fact, resist big business interests and do something about climate.
Yeah, certainly. It's, as I do with a lot of things, I sort of complexify them. So it's a bit of a mixed story. There has been a lot of success, but there's also been a lot of unintended consequences and a lot of political dynamics that have shifted. And so it hasn't been completely positive, but I think for a lot of folks interested in concerned about the climate crisis, no one thought 10 years ago that you could stop a major project like the Keystone XL pipeline. And in fact, activists had a lot of difficulty even getting going on that campaign, and people kind of laughed them out of the room and said, this is sort of crazy. You can't stop a pipeline like this. But fast forward now, to propose a pipeline of this kind of size and scale now would be seen as sort of similarly a bit of a wild idea, given how much has changed in the last 10, 15 years.
Wow, really an interesting story of pendulum swings then.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess, did you come to a PhD from an energy background, or was that something like, what motivated you to pursue your PhD and then this research agenda?
Yeah, I actually came in with a trade background, and I was really interested in the intersection of trade and climate politics. But when I was doing my coursework in 2015 and 2016, there were so many pictures of protests against the Keystone XL project, which a lot of folks have heard about, but some of these other projects, particularly in Canada. And I couldn't stop wondering whether or not these protests were having an impact on these projects. I was a student of social justice. I've been to a protest or two. And so I really was interested in this question, are these movements having any impact? And so I ended up switching gears during my PhD, and I ended up focusing on looking at pipeline politics. Although trade always finds a way in there. I'm writing again a little bit about trade now and border carbon adjustment, because a lot of these things are kind of closely intertwined. So
yeah, I was just going to say, it seems to follow logically how you end up in oil from trade, right? Because I would imagine that oil is a large part of global trade, right? There's a lot of movement there. So I guess if you could go back to 2015, Amy, or to somebody in 2022, what advice would you give master's students that are in the same field about thinking about applying for a PhD? Is this a question that needs a PhD for? What can they do to be more successful? Those kinds of useful nuts and bolts things.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I get requests from folks considering PhDs, I think I'm actually talking to someone tomorrow who's interested in our department at University of Toronto. I always love to hear sort of how they came to this point, because it's, as you know, it's a tough slog and it's not the right fit for everyone. But I think the folks that are and like myself, who are really driven by a particular question that they're not seeing being answered, or really just want to improve their research skills. I wasn't sure ultimately that I wanted to be an academic, but I knew that I wanted to have better research skills, whether that was, in a sort of a policy context or working with some non-governmental organizations that I do some side work with. I recognized the need. They needed more research, capacity, and I didn't have the confidence coming out of even my master's. I felt like I still had a lot to learn in terms of methods and things. So that's really been sort of my guiding motivation. That's usually what I'm, when students are asking me, like, should I be considering a PhD versus some of these other things? I definitely always fall back on some of those pieces. Because as you know, it can be, there's ups and downs, there's highs and lows. And I think, you're doing it wrong. And at some point you think, why am I doing this? Because often these questions are really time sensitive. And so sometimes the long process of doing a PhD can be frustrating for people who are really, things are happening on the ground all the time, but to find ways to kind of balance doing some, smaller research things that you can kind of get out into the public during your PhD, not having to wait to read the book, 5+ years later, is something to think about as well. And ultimately why I decided to do a PhD as opposed to approach these things from, other angles is really to take the time and space to do a really deep dive into an issue and not just, take the hot takes on social media or in our newspapers or whatever, but you have that time and the resources to be able to answer the question that you want to answer in the way that you think it best needs to be answered.
Yeah.
PhD is really the only way to do that.
It can be really challenging when you're working on policy relevant questions in an interdisciplinary way to know if sort of the academy, so to speak, is the right cauldron for learning, or if it's, being in that position. But I think your point about like, this is the only time in your life when you're going to be able to like block out 5 years to really get hip deep into these questions and like try to pull together all of these different pieces is a good one, right? But it is a sacrifice. It's a long slog for what ends up being, an entry level or a mid-level job. So, we've heard a little bit about like why you're interested in energy and in sort of this sort of environmental policy lens, right? But what keeps you going? Like, why do you continue to work on this? You mentioned a minute ago, right, that at some point you always think that you're doing it wrong, right? And we are, right? Part of this process is trial and error. But what are some of the issues that you've run into in researching this, and how have you wiggled your way around them to find something rewarding?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What really motivates me is sort of these interrelated concerns around energy, economics, and climate change, and really the climate crisis. And living in a country like Canada, where we're continuing to build new fossil fuel infrastructure, and there's massive waves of Indigenous-led resistance and response. Really, I was motivated to try to make sense of all of this. You get such kind of competing narratives in the news, and I really wanted to, even for myself, just understand really what was going on and really what were some of the impacts. In terms of some of the challenges, certainly as a settler doing work where Indigenous-led resistance is really some of the core, and Indigenous politics are really at the core of some of this work. Finding ways to do my research in a way that was appropriate and that would create space for more scholarship and more work on this issue, but also still understanding a lot of the dynamics that are taking place, and understanding sort of the settler context, the settler colonial context in Canada, and how that really has affected a lot of issues around land and Indigenous rights and resistance. So that's been really important, but it's always a difficult position to be in, difficult space to hold as an ally, and constantly sort of checking in. And given the constraints of the PhD and even the timeline, not having enough time to really build a lot of the relationships that I would have liked to. So that was one issue. Another issue is access. I was able to interview executives of oil companies and pipeline companies, and I was a little nervous about whether or not I would get access, but I actually was fairly successful with that. It was actually harder to get interviews with NGOs, often because they're just so strapped for time. So that was definitely something trying to navigate, but over a few different rounds of interviews, I was able to get a lot of really helpful insights. And then, like I mentioned before, kind of balancing my research with sort of more activist kind of research, working with different organizations, Council of Canadians or Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. These are NGOs in Canada I tend to work with. It can be tough to balance sort of their agenda, your agenda, and matching, your research and expertise to what they're working on. Can be tricky sometimes, but I've had a lot of opportunity to kind of think about how to do that and how to do that well. And so I'm always happy to support an organization when I can, doing some sort of side research for them or analysis for them.
Yeah, it can be really, really challenging, right? To kind of have this, you have your own self as a person and you have yourself as a researcher, and particularly on issues where we work in the overlap of those Venn diagrams, right? About like, how do you navigate that of, here are my personal politics, and then here is sort of my research agenda and these questions that I'm trying to get to, and like all of those things. That is definitely
yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, it is. It feels a lot like it's it can be a process of trial and error, right? But it also it definitely brings resonance to your work. I think that in a way that researching something that is devoid from your own personal belief system, right, doesn't. It's so I mean, I'm a big fan of bringing the whole person into the research agenda. So you have my total support on that. I want to build on your first point, right, about the challenges or the need, right, to hold space for these Indigenous and critical perspectives, right? Because you mentioned that in your written Scholar Spotlight interview that we will have up on the website, about these people that have inspired you, and you talk about Kate Neville, and I'm really excited to talk about her kind of as we close out. But I was struck by your explicit dedication to, like, I'm bringing these perspectives into my work and trying to engage with them really intentionally. Can you give me sort of the 10-second what lens does this bring, right? And how does it really enrich your work?
Yeah, I think really understanding the kind of settler colonial context, institutions that have really shaped the policy landscape for a lot of the struggles around pipelines and other kinds of infrastructure today is really something that you cannot explain what's happening without understanding that historical context, and to understand the failure to really negotiate treaties with a lot of Indigenous groups, particularly on the side of the federal, the provincial government, that have dragged out negotiations or refused to really negotiate in good faith, that have created quite a patchwork of kind of different legal and treaty contexts. And so that's now the landscape where pipeline politics are playing out today. And so the changing legal landscape and the increasing rights that particularly Indigenous groups have in Canada now has really been because of contestation over pipelines, for good and for bad. We still have a settler colonial legal system, and it's on Indigenous groups to come to the court and prove that they have title and claim to their land, which is quite backwards, but that's how that's working. But they have been winning in the courts and have stopped several major pipeline projects because of that. So I really try to engage with some of the really exciting new work on Indigenous resurgence and refusal to participate in some of these institutions, but also the necessity of having to do so, even though the odds are really sort of stacked against Indigenous rights in a lot of contexts. So there's a lot of really awesome work going on in this space that I try to engage in, and hopefully create space for other folks, because I'm only telling one very small piece of this story, and there's so many stories that touch on Indigenous rights and land rights and pipeline struggles in so many ways.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me about how deep stuff goes, right? Of that, like, okay, so we're talking about pipelines, right? It was pipelines. I don't know very much about pipelines, but they're a modern invention, right? This is not something that we're talking about back in the 1500s or what have you. But the story of how we get to pipelines and the dynamics around pipelines and the structural factors that like we don't even think about or see do go back that far, right? And are, you know, we can't tell this story without also telling the story of Manifest Destiny and colonialism and kind of trying to bring the new world under the boot of Europe and what have you. And so I think many people are quick to sort of say, well, here is my little piece, right, of politics, and this is how this just sort of operates. And you know, I don't do energy politics, so it's not something that I'm really paying attention to, but they're doing something else that's a structural piece, right? And so it actually really does connect into this larger story of the rules of the game got set long ago, and now we're trying to renegotiate them. And so there are dynamics at play that you have to understand, right? You cannot be an energy scholar and not talk about colonialism, right? So you gotta expand, exactly. Right? Showing off that I am an avowed interdisciplinary human being that thinks that we should all be engaging across a lot of literatures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's something that, you know, it's not always encouraged or embraced, you know, adding, you know, all kinds of other conversations, because there are some, you know, there's responsibility in, you know, doing that interdisciplinary work well, but you're right, you can't explain what's going on without understanding the colonial context in my case. And I'm sure in your research as well, there's a lot of, you know, maybe parallels around the, you know, colonial or imperial context in which you're doing your research.
Yeah. Well, actually, that transitions us beautifully into sort of the next thing that I wanted to bring up, which is you talk a lot about supply side factors, right? And that as a supplying nation, Canada has a very sort of weird relationship with oil. And as I was reading and stalking you on the internet, it translates a lot into drugs. Actually, there's a lot of really interesting parallels so I work on drug trafficking in some aspects, and arms and drugs, and kind of these parallels between oil and oil supply, and like how states that are supply side states, right, have different abilities to stop or engage or what have you than demand side states do. And so often we focus on sort of the wrong side of that equation. But talk to me a little bit more about supply side factors for people who don't do drugs, study drugs. You know, why is a supply side, the fact that Canada is a supply side state, important?
Yeah, it's a great question. And going back to what you had talked about a couple minutes ago about trade, I mean, 80% of our oil in Canada is exported to the US. And so you can imagine that kind of dependency, the kind of politics that creates. So really, when we think about supply side climate policy, a country like Canada that's an exporter of fossil fuels and things like heavy oil, it becomes almost politically impossible to change that, you know, to talk about a just transition or a wind down of fossil fuels or whatever language that you want to use, because there has been very much this dependency, and particularly in a couple key places in Alberta, there's a very potent kind of political cocktail that makes it very, very, very difficult to talk about these kinds of things. And of course, you have a lot of international dynamics that are playing out around, you know, countries' climate commitments and changing forecasts around, you know, oil, energy and demand and oil prices, of course. And so you have all of these things sort of that are happening internationally that are playing out domestically in Canada. And as well, the sort of the transnational activists networks and that story as well. So my research is really trying to make sense of how are these things kind of combining and shaping how social movements are influencing things, how are they shaping, you know, how oil producers are thinking about these things. And we've seen a real shift in the last year with COVID that really seems to be sort of the wake-up call for the oil industry, despite, you know, so many other challenges. COVID has really I think, brought to light real uncertainty around future demand for oil. And so that's really reshaping kind of conversations that we're having now. Of course, the oil and gas industry has been pretty successful in getting exemptions and bailouts and support, but not nearly as much as you might imagine, or maybe what we would have seen, you know, even 5 years ago. So these things are definitely shaking out, and it's certainly, you know, changing. Global oil demand is playing a role. The success of a lot of organizations and coalitions and social movements in stopping new fossil fuel infrastructure. But now with COVID, we're really seeing quite a significant shift in really the political power and the economic power of the oil industry. And Canada has been significantly weakened. And so that's creating space, but also more competition as, you know, particularly gas companies are trying to angle for, you know, to become the next kind of bridge fuel for the energy transition.
Interesting. So a policy window might be opening, which is interesting, right? And that's where we are going to see the social movements, right, sort of drive through some solutions, hopefully.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because the politics of saying no, you know, the politics of resisting infrastructure are very different than the politics of yes, and how do we get to where we want to go. And so it's a little bit more challenging, but I think we're seeing there's a lot of reason for optimism, you know, with climate marches and proposals for, you know, Green New Deal and this kind of thing. There's a lot of energy, and it's just a matter of doing the work of getting groups alongside and really trying to think about, you know, visions and transformation in sort of a condensed timeline to try to take advantage of, like you say, this window that's opened up because of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's, I'm choosing to believe it's a story of hope, but I think your perspective on the politics of saying no are different, right, than the politics of saying yes, right, and the dynamics that make really good organizations capable of being that sort of that resistance movement, but then having them transition to be a policy entrepreneur, that sort of connection gets lost sometimes, right? And so we see these really promising moments get missed, and that always gives me intense anxiety.
Yeah.
So sort of, I guess, close us out. Looking ahead, what for supply side states like Canada, who are so reliant, right, on the infrastructure and the money that comes with fossil fuels, what's the way forward? You know, what is the thing that we should be saying yes to, I guess? And you don't have to have all the solutions, but if you've got a good one, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, this is such an important question, and honestly one that I am, you know, I don't have all the answers. I've spent so much time looking at what not to do. So I know what not to do, but I think there's a lot of potential in really doing this work to bring communities along. And so you see policy solutions in places where we might not expect to find them, in communities and in Alberta as well, where we're having conversations with oil and gas workers or with coal workers, you know, talking about what is the future that we're looking for, and how do we get there, and what's needed to bring communities, particularly those that are really resource dependent, along in that conversation. We know when that doesn't happen, that leads to a lot more complications and issues. And it's not an easy or quick process, and there's no single solution or single policy. But I think generally it starts with ideas. And when we can start to have conversations and bring people from perhaps very different sides and different positions that are in different communities that have very different interests, bring them together and talk about some of these things, and kind of talk about what we want our communities to look like, you know, 5, 10, 50, 100 years from now. I think that provides a really great common point to start thinking about some of these questions, as opposed to coming at it from, you know, do you want a pipeline in your backyard, yes or no? Because that's always the surefire way to start things kind of on the wrong foot. So that would be sort of one piece of the puzzle, but there's some amazing folks, Angela Carter, Kathy Harrison, and other scholars that are looking at, you know, where do we go from here and what's really needed. And so I hope to keep, you know, being a part of that conversation as I go forward in my research.
Yeah, that's good. That's really important, that the role of nuancing those conversations, because so often for those of us who are not experts, right, the answer, the question is always, why would you want a pipeline? But it's obviously a lot more complex than that, right, and gets into much more of a story about jobs and the economy and all sorts of interrelated identity, right, all of those sort of, those hard things and soft things that then they sort of fit together. Anyway, I really appreciate your time, Amy. I have learned so much already, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book when it comes out. Remind us of the title.
Yeah, well, the title is tentative right now, but Mega Pipelines, Mega Resistance is the tentative title for now.
It sounds like a good Christmas gift coming up. I really appreciate your time, Amy, and we will talk to you hopefully soon.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.